Good morning.
I missed the last 2 Sundays. Do you have handouts?
I do. Ask me afterward, yeah. Okay, it is time to begin today, so let's open with a word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we just give you thanks again for life itself, for health, for strength, for the privilege of being able to gather together in this fashion today. We thank you for working out these details, so even in the midst of this so-called crisis, we can still be here and we can still worship you individually as well as corporately. We thank you for the safety you have granted and the good health to KBCers, and we pray for your continued provision and strength in these matters as we try to humanly do what we can to protect ourselves. We realize that ultimately we're in your hands, and we look to you for your wonderful fatherly care. As always, we come this morning with humbleness as we approach the Word of God. We realize that this is the only book you've ever written, and it is a matchless book indeed, so far beyond us, and yet you've given it to us to reveal yourself. You want us to understand some things, and so we pray that as we enter into this holy sphere, shall we say, as we enter into this holy place with you, that we would be teachable, that we would want the Holy Spirit to direct our steps. And as always, we want to bring it to bear on our lives today because you've given us your word so it can change us in the present to be more like Christ. So exalt yourself, we pray. Give us a good study time in Jesus' matchless name. Amen. Okay, it's Daniel chapter 8. If you don't have one of these, if you need some, Jeff, do you have Daniel chapter 8? Handouts right here, some if you want to come and get some. Just by way of quick review, because we're about halfway through this chapter. We started last week, and we said that in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel begins in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. He has a vision. So this is about 550 BC. And in this vision, he saw, as he says in verses 3 following, he saw this a ram who had 2 horns. The ram was over here, and later in the chapter is identified as the Medo-Persian Empire. And that ram was actually moving to the west, and as it was going, it was unconquerable, if you will, and it was covering a lot of ground. But in the midst of it, it said there was a he-goat that came from the opposite direction. Later on in the chapter, that's identified as the Grecian Empire. And as we said, it's just like 2 wild animals just butting heads together. And the he-goat, the Grecian Empire overcame the Romans, overcame the Medo-Persian Empire and took over. And Alexander the Great, of course, was that significant, notorious horn that was standing up. And in a matter of just a couple of years, he conquered more of the ancient Near East than Cyrus and the Persians had in over a quarter of a century. And so we have that. And then, as you know, Alexander died very young after about 12 or so, 13 years reigning. And really, with some power plays, etc., his kingdom was divided among 4 generals. And the 4 generals that took over are Seleucus, who took over up here in this area of Asia, of modern-day Syria and Asia Minor, and Ptolemy was the one who took over down here in Egypt, and those 2 of the 4 are the ones that really come into play in Bible history and Bible prophecy, because, as you can see, Palestine, and I hope the map is big enough and it's not drawn to proportion, of course, but giving you a little perspective. Palestine is right in the middle, and so you're going to have, as the Ptolemies and Seleucids are constantly fighting and back and forth, they're always passing through Palestine, Israel, and that's how they come into play so much, or they came into play so much in the past, but also this is the area where they will come into play again in the future. And so that's pretty much brings us up. Well, one other thing, we noted that out of the Seleucid dynasty, there was this one man who was raised up over the others, and his name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled from about 175 down to 163. And Antiochus was the one who, one of these times when he was fighting here, etc., as he was going through Jerusalem, he simply stopped off again. And as he did, he, as you remember, desecrated the temple. And because he was a Greek, the whole point was Hellenization, to try and get everybody in the empire to be like the Hellenists, like the Greeks, to think like them, to worship their gods, to act like them, just across the board. And so naturally, he tried to get the Jews to submit. Some of the Jews bought into it. They sided with him, if you will, against fellow Jews, and other Jews said, we will give our lives. But the temple was desecrated, etc., for about 3 years. And finally then in 165, 164, we have this guy named Judas Maccabeus and his brothers who cleansed the temple and took it back for the Jews. And of course, that was when we get the original Feast of Lights, which is the modern day Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Okay? So that's where we talked about all that stuff last week, and that's just a real quick review. So if you weren't here or didn't get it last week, sorry about that, but you can look at your handout. Okay, so we were ready to pick up at about verse 13. So after Daniel has seen all this stuff, etc., I mean, you can imagine how he would have been. His mind was just overwhelmed. It's just like, what in the world is going on here? So verse 13, I heard one saint speaking unto another saint, speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So when Daniel saw this vision and he saw the sanctuary, that it had been desecrated, he's saying, how long until it is going to be cleansed? How long until the Jews are going to take it back again? And this angel answered and said, unto 2,300 days. Now, literally, it says 2,300 evening morning, okay? And so that brings up the question, well, how long are 2,300 evening singular, morning singular, okay? So as I put on your sheet, we have a couple of different ways that you can take it. They're right toward the middle of the sheet, verses 13 and 14. It can mean 2,300 days. So some say, well, yeah, an evening and a morning make up a day, so that's 2,300 days, which is approximately 6.4 years. Or because it says evening, morning, remember the Jews had 2 sacrifices that they needed to perform every single day, a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice. We'll see that later when we get to Daniel chapter 9. And so it could be that when it says 2,300 morning, evening, you should cut it in half, and it would actually be 1,150 days. And how long is 1,150 days? It is 3.2 years. Okay, so it's basically 6.4 years versus 3.2 years. And those who would simply say, no, it's supposed to be 2,300 days, the 6.4 years, you say, well, how can that be? Because when this was fulfilled, actually Antiochus only desecrated it for about 3.5 years, not 6.4 years. Well, people who interpret it this way say basically the time begins from when he seriously came here and began to persecute the Jews, which was about 171 or 170, and it would go down to about the time of his death or when the temple was cleansed. And roughly speaking, when you calculate it out, you come out to about 6.4 years. Otherwise, and I think the best interpretation is actually the 3.2 years, that would be the actual time when the temple was desecrated, because we know that it was approximately 3.5 years. Bob? Yeah, that's where when you start calculating, and of course liberal critics will look at this and say, basically, no matter which way you take it, it doesn't come down to the exact hour, so that just proves this is a farce. Well, no, there can be a rounding off of numbers and everything like that. And it could be that if we knew the exact moment when God said, this is being desecrated until it's cleansed, it literally would be to the second, if you will. So this is not just a loosey-goosey thing like really, it was desecrated a year and a half, but let's round it off to 3.2. No, it's not that way at all. But yeah, generally, if you look at and you say, well, what was their calendar, roughly speaking, and so it's 360 days in a year, etc. Aaron? Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Right. And you're a biblical scholar and didn't even know it. Because people who favor this view, they will refer to that very thing. And they say, look at Genesis 1. An evening and a morning make one complete day. So if we have an evening and a morning, that makes one complete day. So it should be the full 2,300. And that is a possibility. But in this particular case, because of the way it is stated and because of the Jewish sacrifices, where they would sacrifice. And so when you look at it and you say, well, how many sacrifices for how many days could they not sacrifice? A morning sacrifice 1, an evening sacrifice 2. That's why you can half it. And I think personally, although you're in good company, there are a lot of biblical scholars who would say most definitely we've got to follow this one. So if you'd like to argue about it, we can meet in the parking lot. No. This is not the kind of hill I would die on, okay? But in light then of actual history, after it transpired, and we see that really it is very close to this, that also helps me to favor it. And then, of course, we see the Bible talking about in the future when the Antichrist, because Antiochus is simply a type of the Antichrist who is yet to come, and in the future, the Jewish temple will be desecrated for 42 months. And 42 months is 3.5 years. When you start putting all that together in hindsight, I think that's why I would favor this. Great question. Okay, so that's the way that we can interpret those. Now, in verses 15 to 19, so it came to pass when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai. Remember, according to verse 1, Daniel was there on the banks of probably this kind of water course off of the main river. And this individual called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. So in verses 15 to 19, as you see on your handout, as Daniel is seeking understanding, and this angel came, this is sometimes referred to as like the interpreting angel motif. And what do we mean by that? Well, as I gave you the quote here, a human prophet sees a vision which is highly symbolic and complex, and the nature of the vision is such that the prophet is incapable of understanding its meaning apart from its interpretation by a heavenly being. And so this angel, Gabriel, was specifically sent to Daniel to interpret it. Now, according to Jewish tradition, Gabriel is one of the 7 archangels, even though the Bible never calls him an archangel. He's simply referred to as an angel. And I gave you the 4 references there where he occurs. Gabriel, by name, only occurs twice in Daniel and then twice in Luke chapter 1. And what is Luke chapter 1 all about? Birth of Jesus and John the Baptist, the Annunciation. So those are the only 4 references in the Bible to Gabriel by name. And actually, even though he's not mentioned here, although he will come up later in the book, The only other named angel in the Bible is the archangel Michael. And Michael will occur 3 times in the book of Daniel, once in the book of Jude, and then once in the book of Revelation. Okay? So, as we read here, when Gabriel came to Daniel, Daniel was greatly affected by seeing him. He fell down. He was fearful. It's even possible that this is reference to like he simply became unconscious. This vision had overwhelmed him, and the appearance of this angel overwhelmed him. And Gabriel says, causes him to stand up on his feet, and he says, hey, I am going to tell you things that concern the end. And notice, if you will, the emphasis on the end. I think that's very important here, where he says in verse 17, for at the time of the end will be the vision. Verse 19, in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed, the end shall be. And I say the emphasis there is because I think that helps us to understand that in reality now we are going to have another major gap in the biblical record. A lot of interpreters want to simply say, okay, all of this in the rest of this chapter is simply dealing with what would be history to us. It's talking again about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. But I don't believe it is. As we're going to see in just a moment, I think actually he is going to be talking about the Antichrist. And therefore, when he says the end, he's not just saying the end of the Seleucids or the end of this empire. He's saying at the time of the end of world history, which is even, of course, future to us. And so, as we read then, let's see, well, verses 20 to 23 is actually, we don't need to go back over them again, because basically Gabriel is now interpreting verses 3 to 8 to Daniel. So this is how we knew earlier in the chapter. We were talking about the Medo-Persian Empire going west, and the Grecian Empire and Alexander coming from the east and attacking him, because that's what Daniel says here. That's what Gabriel says here. Verse 20, the ram you saw is Media-Persia. Verse 21, the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And he talks about how when that horn is broken, verse 22, Alexander the Great, 4 kingdoms will stand up, but not in his power. And those 4 kingdoms then were the 2 that I didn't mention here today, but the Seleucids and Ptolemies as well. So the key then is we come to verse 23. And as I put on your sheet, this is where there can be a difference of interpretation again. But as I put in bold type, it appears that there are more than 2,000 years between verses 22 and 23. Okay, so think of our big timeline once again, what we're talking about. What Daniel is seeing here, he saw the Medo-Persian Empire, which was from 539 down to about 336. And then he saw the Grecian Empire, about 336 down to 63. And these are all BCs, okay? And so as verse 22 ends, he says how Alexander's kingdom was divided into 4 kingdoms. Okay, so that's the 4 kingdoms we talked about. The one general getting some some land over here, another one up here, Seleucus here, and Ptolemy here. Okay, but then when we pick up in verse 23, and in the latter time, another expression here for the end days, which makes me again believe that this extreme emphasis is on the end, which is down the road even from us. In the latter time of their kingdom, when transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences will arise. And this seems to be none other than the Antichrist himself. So you think of after the Greeks, then we had the Roman Empire, and then of course, you might say we are here, and then you're going to have the rapture of the church, and then we're going to have the 7-year tribulation period, okay? And it is during the 7-year tribulation when we are going to have the Antichrist who will arise. And as we said, Antiochus is basically a type for the Antichrist, or as I refer to it, the Antichrist is basically Antiochus on steroids, okay? I mean, everything we read in the Bible about this guy is incredibly egocentric and ungodly, etc., slicker than who knows what with everything he did. And when we look back in history, as we read last week, even in the Apocrypha, secular writers, they say things about Antiochus that show us indeed he fulfilled every one of those things God prophesied. And now when we read biblical material on the Antichrist, we find that he is even slicker. He is even more egocentric. He is more deified, if you will. And of course, what is the anti preposition on the front? What is that prefix in English? How do we use that? Anti, it means what? Against or opposite or in the place of. And of course, that's exactly the way Antiochus was, and that's exactly the way the Antichrist will be. He will be totally opposed to God and everything that God stands for, but he will also place himself in the place of God. Why do you need God when you have me? And that's exactly what Antiochus IV was doing way back here. He was indeed putting himself, and that's why, remember his name, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, that was the name they gave to him. Epiphanes simply means the illustrious one, the shining one, God manifest, and because that's exactly how he saw himself. Well, Antichrist is going to be taking that to a whole new level. So, I say all this because it appears then that between verses 22 and 23, we're going all the way from the end of Antiochus, 163 BC, and that's verse 22. Verse 23 picks up way down here, and so as you can see, we've already had more than 2,000 years of history that would be between those two verses in the Bible. And earlier in the chapter, we noted where there were hundreds of years between verses, and this is not unfamiliar with other places in the Bible as well, where literally there will be decades, centuries, or even longer between verses. As we read them, we just think, oh, I ended this verse, the next verse is tomorrow. No, not necessarily. There can be gaps of time between it. And I think such is the case here as well. So as we pick up with verses 23 following, it says that out of one of these Gentile kingdoms, because eschatologically the Bible does say that in these last days there will indeed arise these Gentile kingdoms. Basically, we often refer to it as like a revival of the ancient Roman Empire, and there will be some very strong kings, but there will be one of them who will exalt himself above all these other kings, and that is none other than the individual we call the Antichrist. And so as verse 23 says here, in the latter days of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Okay, the fierce countenance is simply a hard, unyielding, adamant, shall we say, attitude, a hardness of face, where basically he simply says, in effect, I dare you to stand against me because I am supreme. And thus, we are beginning to indeed see this person who is the antitype of Antiochus IV himself. So, verse 23, he will be a very aggressive schemer who knows how to plot and get exactly what he wants. Now, what about that expression in the King James Version at the end of verse 23 when it says, he will understand dark sentences? Okay, maybe you have an NIV, New International Version with you, and it says he will be a master of intrigue. In other words, he will be a very deceitful individual who knows exactly how to pull all the right strings at the right time. And that is very possible because this is pretty difficult Hebrew here. But it's possible, maybe you have an English Standard Version where it says he is one who understands riddles. And that's closer to actually what the Hebrew says. It says He is one who indeed has understanding in, or he is smart or wise when it comes to riddles. And I think possibly that's the best interpretation because I gave you some cross references. The word here for riddles is the same word that is used in Judges chapter 14. What is Judges chapter 14 all about when you think of the word riddles? Samson, okay, that's the Samson account. When you think of 1 Kings 10 and riddles, we're going to need to have a class on chapter content of the Old Testament so you can snap this stuff off. That's the Queen of Sheba. What did the Queen of Sheba do? Came to Solomon seeking understanding in questions and riddles. And then in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 6, when the book of Proverbs begins, Solomon says that I am going to, with these Proverbs, give you wisdom, understanding, so that you can indeed put 2 and 2 together and come out with 4, as we would say, so you can understand riddles, hard things. And so I think that's probably the best way to take the term here because that's the way it is most often used here in the Old Testament. And so on your sheet, I put a quote that I think summarizes this well. Antichrist will be inspired of Satan to attempt rivalry of the Christ in his character of sole hierophant, or revealer of secret things. He too, that is, Antichrist, will present himself as one in whom are hidden treasures of wisdom and knowledge, and he will dazzle and bewitch men by his solutions of the enigmas of life. Some of those words that are spoken here, who are they spoken of in the Bible and other places? Jesus himself. And that's why when we say this is Antichrist, he's going to present himself and say, I'm really the one who can solve all these problems for you. Why would you need Christ? What has Christ ever done for you? But look at me, what I am going to do for you. And because he is such a slick talker, everything is so polished, he knows exactly how to manipulate people with his deceitful intrigue, he will be able to have his way. Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, when you study some of this end-time stuff, you're kind of scratching your head like, how could people ever fall for some of those things? And then you read yesterday's newspaper and say, oh, yeah, now I can understand it when you see the way people are today. Totally messed up in their thinking, totally contrary to any mooring to absolute truth. And so the field is going to be set for the Antichrist as he comes. And therefore, he will be able to indeed trick people and make them believe, well, yeah, this guy really is greater than Christ. This guy really solves problems better than Christ ever did. And they will simply fall into his lap. Verses 24 and 25, as I put on your sheet, this is basically the modus operandi, or the method of operation of the Antichrist, who is a master in Machiavellian arts. And when you think or you hear the word Machiavellianism or Machiavelli, what is a phrase that probably or hopefully immediately jumps in your mind? Nothing jumps in your mind. Power, that's true. Let's see, is this a time I should pick on Wilson since I have 3 options today? Yeah. Oh, okay, no candy bar today, so. Machiavelli is the one we use the expression, the end justifies the means. In other words, as long as the end accomplishes what you want to accomplish it doesn't matter how you get there. And well, if you think you are God and everybody is supposed to worship you, truth doesn't come into play, okay? All you say is, what do I need to do to get these people to kiss up to me? What do I need to do to get them to drink my Kool-Aid, as we might say? Okay, and so when you follow these next verses, I tried to kind of summarize them on your sheet with some of those asterisks. Where first of all, he's going to have a powerful PR campaign. PR meaning, of course, public relations. For his strength, it says it is not by his own power. Now, what in the world does that mean? He's so strong, but yet it's not by his own power. Well, the point here is simply that what he's going to do is going to exceed the greatest of human power you can imagine. You say, well, what is he going to be? A robot? Are we talking about artificial intelligence here? What's going on? No, the point is, some would say this refers to the fact that he will be energized by Satan. And that is very true, and that is very possible. Other interpreters say, well, actually, this means that because God raised him up for this mission, God is going to allow him to have these incredible powers that no human being had ever had before. And we know from the Bible that kind of thing is true, where God does allow even very ungodly people to have incredible power and incredible knowledge, because it's part of the way God is using them to accomplish his purpose and eventually to judge them. So this guy is going to be not only slick, but he is going to be incredibly powerful. It also says, goes on to say that this will enable him to prosper by using his power, his cunning policies, and peace. That is, he's going to come in. He's not going to come in with sword in hand like you either submit or else I will chop you up. But he's going to be such a nice talker that he's just going to convince you, sitting across the table from you having coffee and donuts, you're going to be convinced that he is who he says he is. And why would you need Christ when you have him? Because he's in control of everything. And so all this is playing together. It says he will especially vent his anger against the holy people, which is Israel. And in his self-exaltation, notice verse 25, and through his policy also he will cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace will destroy many, and shall stand up against the Prince of Princes. Who is the Prince of Princes? This is none other than God himself. But he will be broken without hand. What does that mean? It means when he is defeated, it won't be because there will be somebody who is more powerful than him who happens to beat him on a battlefield. He will be broken by a power that far exceeds his power, and that is by none other than God himself. And you can go back to the book of Revelation chapter 19, the last couple of verses, where we find he will have, shall we say, a final battle against the Lord, and the Lord will judge him and consign him to a place of eternal punishment. So the picture we get here when you put all these verses together, it constantly emphasizes the word destroy. He's going to be very destructive. He's going to be very smart. He's going to be, I think we could say, good looking. He's going to know exactly how to stroke people to get exactly what he wants. And because he's going to be energized by the devil in incredible ways, and God's going to let him have this kind of power, it will indeed be amazing what he's able to accomplish. And like I say, when we read other Bible passages about him, you say, all this just fits into line. It all unifies or comes to the same conclusion about this person of incredible evil. Now, verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up, and I did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So verse 26, Daniel, again, was just overwhelmed by it, but when he did rise up and do the king's business, verse 26, he was overwhelmed with this, but the Lord said, this is true, and he said, shut up the vision. When we hear the word shut up, that basically would mean, in the sense of close it up, hide it, don't let anybody read it. Well, that's not the point here. The point here is preserve this vision. Keep this vision. It doesn't mean he couldn't go out and talk about it, because it seems quite evident that he really did. And that's why it says neither Daniel nor anybody else really could fully grasp what was being revealed here. So the Lord is simply saying, preserve this. This is true. As I would say, take it to the bank. It's going to happen even if it doesn't happen in your days. In verse 27, Daniel's physical response was, again, just totally overwhelmed by this, completely drained, emotionally exhausted, but he simply was able to recover. And then as he pondered the meaning, he went back and he did the king's business, whatever his daily task really was. So, wow, what an incredible chapter with this sweep of history. Again, taking us, remember, Daniel was writing this in about 550. The Medo-Persian Empire took over in 539, and then we see what happened with the Greeks and Alexander, and then as we go all the way down here to that which is even future to us. Now, what are some takeaways? A couple of them I gave you here as we spend our time on these to conclude today. The first one is there is a thread that seems to tie this chapter together, and maybe it doesn't jump out quite as much in the English for us, but in the Hebrew it does because of one word that is used over and over and over again, and it is the word great. So in verse 4, it says, notice that the ram became great. And remember that ram was Cyrus of the Medo-Persians. Okay? And then in verse 8, it says the goat was great, and that is Alexander the Great under the Greeks. And then we also read in verses 9, 10, and 11 of Antiochus IV, who was great or who magnified himself. Antiochus IV is the one who came even farther down the road here. Okay? And then we read in verse 25, this king of fierce countenance will magnify himself, and that is the Antichrist down here. Okay? And even though in English you have great and magnify, it's actually simply the Hebrew word great. But the way the language is, it can, if depending on the way the verb is, it means simply to make great or to make yourself great, and that's why the English translates it magnify. But the point that I think we should see here is, notice, the four major characters in this chapter all thought what about themselves? They were great. You know, pat me on the back. Look how fantastic I am. Look at my power. Look at how everything is under my control. But what do we know about every one of these? We know about three of them from history, and we know about another because God said it. But what do we know is going to be their end? They all die because there happens to be a greater person than them who really is in control of everything. And so as I put on your sheet, this common feature, there was self-magnification. They all thought they were at center stage, but they failed to realize God had raised them up because God is really the one who is in control of all of history. Now, does that just happen to be a theme we see in Daniel and in this chapter? Well, we see it here, but I mean this general theme of a king thinks he is deity, or a king thinks he is so great and everybody look at me. Do we only see that in the book of Daniel? Absolutely not. Just think of how that theme is seen all the way through the Bible. I mean, if we go back to Daniel chapter 4, we had Nebuchadnezzar. Remember that one verse where he said, I was walking in my palace and I was marveling at how great I am. And what does the next verse say? He became an animal. He became like an animal for years. Think of Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5. Here, have another drink. Let's party away the night. Oh, these goblets we're using are from the temple in Jerusalem, so-called Yahweh, who thought he was something. Ha, ha, ha. And then he looked up on the wall, and what did he see? Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. You are weighed in God's balances, and you are gone tonight. Wow. And then you think of, as I kind of went back, I thought of like Isaiah chapter 14, which some would say is actually a picture or is actually talking about the fall of Satan. But in context, at least first and foremost, it's talking about the king of Babylon. And what did the king of Babylon say? Going back here, I, me, my, mine. Go back and read it. And what happened? He bit the dust. Ezekiel chapter 28, some would say that also is also telling us about the fall of Satan, and maybe that's true, but in the context, for sure, it is talking about the king of Tyre. What did the king of Tyre say? I will do this. Look at me. And what happened to him? Bit the dust. Okay? And then a fantastic passage is one in Ezekiel 32, about the last half of it's from from verse 17 to the very end. And this is an amazing picture you have when God was judging Tyre, and you find that the king of Tyre is in hell. He's in the place of the dead. He's in the, because it talks about uncircumcised there, it's referring to a place of punishment. And he's there, and all of a sudden he looks around and he says, wait a minute, weren't you the king of this big nation over here east of Israel? And you're in hell? And then he looks over there and he says, hey, I thought you were a king over here and you were the number one person. And you are here to be judged for eternity? And you can read the chapter. He looks all around the room and he looks and he sees all these kings from all these surrounding nations of Israel. And he says, in effect, I can't believe it. We're all in hell together. We're all here under the wrath of God forever. And look how strong we thought we were. Look how self-magnified we were. And as the chapter, I said the king of Tyre, it's the king of Egypt who's there. And when the chapter ends, it says, but he consoled himself. And as commentators will say, this is kind of a perverse way of being comforted for eternity. He consoled himself by looking around and saying, look how many other damned people there are here with me. Look at how many other powerful figures there are who thought that they were something, and now look where we all ended up. Man, that's quite a chapter. But that's exactly what Daniel is seeing here in vision. He's being told, keep your eyes on God, because, as we said at the very beginning of Daniel, God is in control. That's the theme of the book, and the writer is going to be developing it in all these different ways. Wow. So what a great takeaway. Number two, and of course, then think of all the verses in the Bible that talk about how be careful, because pride is only a slippery slide on the way to destruction. And so maybe you're saying, well, this could never apply to me because I will never be president of the United States. Maybe you should put your name out there. Maybe there's a chance. But you don't have to be that high up to come under the wrath of God and to be on the slippery slide toward destruction. In our own ways, we can think that we're kind of top dogs who were above everybody, etc. And God says that's a fast way. That's a fast way down. Number two, in conclusion, a chapter like this reminds us how we need to put on God's armor to stand against the wiles or scheming or craftiness or methods of the devil. You can think of the classic New Testament passage, Ephesians 6, where Paul talks about put on the whole armor of God that you may be able, King James Version says, to stand against the wiles of the devil. The word wiles there, if you saw it in Greek, you would say, wait a minute, you simply bring those Greek letters over and you have the English word method. Well, that's what the Greek word really means, the scheming or the methods, the way the devil works. And so what is Paul telling us there? Be careful, because those who are anti-God have very slick ways of working. And of course, the slickest of all is the devil himself. And think of all of the methods he uses to try and trip us up. The devil is constantly doing that. And so as I gave you the paraphrase from J.B. Phillips here, he translates it that way: beware of all the devil's methods of attack. And we'll close with this illustration, but I like to think of it like this. You know, when you think of, say, a sporting event, and basketball or football, they're good ones to use as an illustration. Let's just say you have a basketball court, okay? And so what happens? One team, the offensive team, comes down here, and the defense doesn't really defend the basket, and so they get a slam dunk. And then the other team goes down here, they miss the scoring, and so when this team comes back here, what do? They simply go running, and they give you another slam dunk. And after about 3 or 4 slam dunks, hopefully, what does the coach do of the team that was supposedly defending here? He calls timeout, and he gets his troops around him and probably says words that shouldn't be repeated in public. But he says, what is your problem? We need to change our method because they're going to the basket, they're slam dunking it. We've got to change our method of stopping them. And so now he just tells them, in effect, stand around here, make them shoot from long range. And if this team comes down and shoots from long range and misses, he's not going to change his defense. But if they start shooting here and now they're getting 3-pointers, he probably will call a timeout and he'll say, okay, You can't just stand back here with your hands in your pocket. You also have to go out here and defend some. And really, that's what sporting events are all about. It's a matter of looking at the method that your opponent is using and coming up with some method to counteract that. And whichever coach is better at doing that, that team is going to win. And that's the way it is when with our daily fight with the devil. The devil tempts me certain ways because of my weaknesses. He tempts you certain ways because of your weaknesses. And if we don't change and gird up those weaknesses, he's going to keep doing it and getting the victory. But if we say, okay, I see what the devil did to get me to fall today, he's not going to get me that way tomorrow. The devil's not going to go home and put his tail between his legs and say, oh, Royce, it's too hard. I'll just stop tempting him. The devil says, let me change my strategy and come up with a new way to do it. And it's a constant, that's what spiritual warfare is, a constant battle. Is the devil going to use his methodology and get the victory, or am I going to keep getting the victory because I'm constantly seeing what he's doing and changing my methodology? And as we see here, in the case of both Antiochus here, way back here, or the Antichrist here, very, very slick. But we too, in our time frame, need to be aware of how the devil is working and trying to get us to kiss up, if you will, to modern day culture. Okay, that's all she wrote for today. So next week, Lord willing, we'll do chapter 9, the first part of it. Lord bless you.